Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight we're having a lot of gun control debates this week. And it's possible you've heard an advocate for gun control say that in this country we have more firearms in civilian hands than we have civilian hands. And that is true, actually. The total American population is about 332 million people, and collectively they own more than 400 million firearms. About half of all U.S. households have at least one gun at home, and many have much more than that. Plus, they have ammo, billions and billions of rounds of it. Those are all real numbers, but they are hardly an argument for gun control. They're an argument, in fact, against it. Ask yourself, what would it require to confiscate all those guns and all that ammunition and turn the United States into a disarmed nation like Turkmenistan or North Korea? Well, it would take a police state, and it would end in civil war. No sane person wants either one of those things, but thankfully, we don't need them. The fact that so many Americans have a firearm within reach but never commit violence tells you that guns are not the problem. Most people in this country can be trusted with an AR-15, just as we can be trusted with cars and light aircraft and electricity and baseball bats and insecticide and chainsaws and pruning shears and countless other objects that could easily double as weapons. On some level, all of us understand this. The problem is always the person, not the tool he uses to commit a crime. If you wanted to stop murder, you would focus on the people who are committing murder, not on the hundreds of millions of their neighbors who are not. You'd really want to know what motivated killers to kill. And the first thing you would do is study what murderers have in common with one another, how they were raised and where, their educational backgrounds, their genetic makeup, drug and alcohol use, their ideological and religious views, their sexual behavior, and probably a whole lot of other factors. You would study murderers, and you would do it with an open mind, as a scientist would. You would be serious about it because it matters. In the late 19th century, researchers finally decided that infection is spread by germs. And as a result of that conclusion, surgeons are now required to wash their hands before they cut you open. Everybody agrees that this is progress. But what if we had refused to learn how infection is spread? What if we just didn't want to know? Well, appendectomies would still be fatal, and we would be a backward, ridiculous, uncaring people. It's impossible even to imagine that. And yet, on the question of violent crime, of murder, it's very easy to imagine that because it's happening. Our leaders are determined not to know why people shoot each other, and they don't want us to know either. They're adamant that we do not ask questions about motive. It seems, for example, like an awful lot of mass shooters have taken prescription psychiatric drugs in the days before they opened fire and killed others. Have you noticed that? Maybe you have noticed that. Good luck saying it in public. You'll be shouted down immediately by someone with an advanced degree. How dare you criticize Big Pharma? What are you, a conspiracy nut? No, actually you're not. You're someone who cares about cause and effect. You're a rational person. The only conspiracy here is the one designed to prevent you from figuring out why mass shootings keep happening. Consider the killings that took place on Monday in Nashville. The killer was a 28-year-old female transgenderist who shot her way into a Christian elementary school and murdered 3 9-year-olds and 3 adults. Why did she do that? In a rational country, that is the very first question we would ask. In our country, it's the last question. In fact, often it's never asked at all. On those rare occasions when somebody finally manages to wonder out loud about motive, our leaders immediately start lying, which should tell you a lot. Here's the Attorney General of the United States yesterday.
I realize that the shooter is dead, but the shooter could have had collaborators. Do you plan on opening a hate crime investigation for the targeting of Christians?
The FBI and ATF are both on the scene working with the local police. As of now, motive hasn't been identified, and the police chief said at his last press conference that they don't yet have reached a conclusion with respect to motive. We are certainly working full-time with them to try and determine what the motive is, and of course motive is what determines whether it's a hate crime or not.
So here's what we just learned from Merrick Garland. The FBI, the ATF, and the Nashville police are all investigating these shootings. Yet, more than 24 hours after they took place, none of those professional investigators can even guess as to why the shootings happened. Motive hasn't been identified, Garland told us. Really? You wonder how that could possibly be. Just before she opened fire, the Nashville shooter wrote these words to her best friend over Instagram, quote, "One day this will make more sense. I've left behind more than enough evidence." That evidence includes a written manifesto where the killer spells out exactly why she killed children. The FBI, the ATF, the Nashville police, and for that matter, Merrick Garland, all have access to that manifesto. And yet somehow the Attorney General informs us that a motive has not yet been identified. Well, he's lying. They all are lying. We can't see the manifesto because the transgender lobby, which has far more power than you do, has pressured politicians to keep it hidden. But we can be certain what it says. Monday's victims were murdered because they were Christians. It's that simple. Transgenderists hate Christians above all, not because Christians are a physical threat. The third graders were not a physical threat, but because Christians refuse to join every other liar in our society and proclaim that transgenderists are gods with the power to change nature itself. Christians are not allowed to say that. They have their own God. And for that refusal, that unwillingness to bow down and worship a false idol, in this case of transgenderism, they were murdered. We have never seen this battle so starkly set as it is now. And it opens to us, to our eyes, the main divide in America. And it's not between race or political party. It's not even between religious affiliation. The divide is between people who think they are God and those who know they are not God. That is what the Nashville shooting was about. It's what virtually everything is about. That conflict exists because these two groups could not be more different. They will be forever at odds with one another, and they always have been. People who know they are not God are by definition restrained. They understand the limits of their own power and of their virtue. They appreciate the complexity of the world, which they freely admit they don't really understand because no human can fully understand it. They may not always be good people, but they are certainly less dangerous people, if only because their ambitions are limited by the acknowledgement of reality. Only God can do certain things, and they know they are not him. Now, people who think they are God are not like this at all. People who believe they're God have no natural limits because God has no limits, nor do they have any real concern for others. They are their own God. They worship themselves. In Freudian terms, they are narcissists, and narcissists admit no fault. They externalize everything. They always blame others. So not surprisingly, given this, transgenderists and their allies spent today attacking Christians just days after a transgenderist murdered Christian children. Here's Congresswoman Catherine Clark of Massachusetts on the House floor.
Layered in my pride is my concern for you. I know your strength, but I also know how determined the forces are that have pitted themselves against you. The politicians and preachers who would rather see you languish in a dark closet than watch you engage the world as you do, cultivating joy and love wherever you go. Let's reject the forces of opposition and bigotry. Let's celebrate the bravery and beauty of our trans community.
Cultivating joy and love wherever you go. This in response to the murder of children by a self-described trans person. You're the victim, transgenderists, not the dead children in Nashville. And of course, virtually everyone in power in this country agreed. Amazon, the company, sent an email to its employees from its LGBTQ plus department, assuring its trans employees that they were affirmed, that they were great people. No mention whatsoever of the dead children in Nashville. Their concern was the only concern. And then NBC News ran this headline, one of many like it. Tennessee's trans community's concerned because of the focus on the identity of the shooter. No update from NBC on how the Christian community in Nashville is doing because who cares? They're just mortals. Their concerns aren't meaningful. Joe Biden certainly doesn't care. Watch him chuckle as he talks about Monday's massacre.
I believe that Christians were targeted in the Nashville school shooting. You believe that Christians were targeted? I have no idea. Josh Hawley believes they were. What do you say to that? Well, I probably don't that. Probably don't. No, I have no idea.
People who believe their God will always turn their rage and frustration outward. They will never blame themselves. How could they? They are God. So you should not be surprised to learn that in the wake of this shooting, when their agenda is revealed for all to see, there will be no contrition, no changing of ways. There will only be acceleration, and there will be more violence coming. And they're telling us that. The press secretary for the governor of Arizona, Katie Hobbs, someone called Jocelyn Berry, who was just resigned apparently, uploaded this photograph hours after the killing along with the message, "Us when we see transphobes." A woman with a gun in her hand, hours after a woman with a gun in her hand killed Christian children in Nashville. In other words, the Christians had it coming. Don't affirm our delusions, we will murder you. Again, this is someone who works for the moderate governor of Arizona, who beat the radical Kari Lake. And once again, this will continue and it will gather speed because the more they are revealed, the more they double down. They can never admit they are wrong because they believe they are gods with the power to control nature. So once again, you should not be surprised at all that there is something called the Trans Day of Vengeance coming this weekend, planned by Antifa in Washington, D.C. It was originally called the Trans Day of Visibility, but the Trans Radical Activist Network, the organizers, decided to change the name just before the massacre in Nashville. Now it's a Trans Day of Vengeance. And they mean vengeance. Vengeance for what? That's not clear. They've been caught, and so they become more aggressive, as people who worship themselves always do. And you can see it all over social media, threatening images everywhere. One trans activist posted this message yesterday, quote, "Kill Christ cucks, behead Christ cucks, roundhouse kick a Christ cuck into the concrete, slam dunk a Christ cuck baby into the trash can." Attached to this post is an image of someone holding a rifle and wearing body armor. Now, you would think in a country supposedly as sensitive to violence as ours, run by an administration that wants to end gun violence, that the Justice Department would be all over this because they're terrified, of course, of groups with guns who are organized trying to upset the social order. But in this case, they're not terrified at all. They have no problem with this whatsoever. We called the DOJ today to ask, what are you doing about this? They didn't bother to get back to us. Meanwhile, the tech barons are, as always, making sure you don't even know what's happening. Twitter, which was supposed to be free, has banned several users, including a sitting member of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Andy Ngo, Sean Davis, for mentioning the existence of the Trans Day of Vengeance. You're not